In a previous video, I did a bunch of work on the 1/24 scale Firebird's rear suspension, and I talked about some of the things that I wanted to do to the front. Mainly, I wanted to make it so that the front tires sit further forward in the wheel wells, and space the front wheels out just a little bit to match the new wider rear end. I started by carefully disassembling the car and removing the body and wheels. I then very carefully removed the lower control arms and disconnected the center link from the steering arms. Next, I begin to assemble the revised steering components and new lower control arms, which will place the knuckle slightly more forward and outward. These new wheel hubs are spaced out further than the previous ones, which will push the wheels out further. I did a little bit of sanding and then glued some magnets to the hubs and then mounted them onto the car. Once everything was assembled, I reinstalled the lower control arms and connected the center link to the steering arms. I printed out a new set of wheels with more back spacing that will be mounted onto the back, since as I mentioned in a previous video, I felt that wider rear wheels would look better after increasing the spacing in the rear. I started by doing a little bit of post-print sanding. Since I will be painting all of the wheels, I removed all the tires by using a tire removing tool and gently tapping. I will also be painting the fender flares as well. All of the flares required a little bit of trimming and sanding before painting. I did this carefully since these are fragile parts with some fine details. I test fit each piece to make sure that they fit snug against the body. I decided to paint the wheels gloss black and the fender flares flat black. I didn't apply the paint too thick so I could preserve some of the finer details. I applied light coats until all of the parts were fully covered. Most of the tires press fit on snug, but for a few that were a bit loose, I used some water washable glue to help make them stick. The wheels looked good before, but they look even better now after being painted. I reinstalled all the wheels and checked to see where the tires will rub against the chassis. I made any modifications as necessary to prevent any rubbing. After that, I reinstalled the body and once again checked to see if the tires will rub. The position of the front wheels is much better than what it was before with the new lower control arms installed. I might still space the front wheels out just a little bit further to try and better match the rear. But with everything back together, I went ahead and did a little bit of driving to see how everything was working. The alignment seems to be better than it was before, and I didn't notice any wheel rubbing while driving. Everything seems to be functioning well, and I didn't encounter any issues. Although I will continue to be messing around with the suspension and steering, overall I'm happy with where the car is at right now, and I'm going to start focusing more on the cosmetic aspects of the car, which I'm really looking forward to getting started on. As I've discussed before, I want to give the Firebird sort of a rough drift missile look, and I decided that I don't want to have the front or rear bumper covers installed. Instead, I want to design some parts that will make it look like the bumpers and rear taillights have been removed, and I also want to design a bash bar for the front. I started by taking some measurements of the front and rear openings, as well as taking a photo of each. These measurements and the picture will aid in the design process, so I can ensure that each part will fit, or at least only require a little bit of sanding and trimming. I contemplated a bit while deciding what software I wanted to use to design these parts. While using a program like Blender would have probably made it a little easier to model all of the little details and curves that you see in the rear section in the reference image on the right. Since I wasn't concerned about the small details or getting it to look exactly like the reference image, I just decided to quickly model it in Fusion 360, especially since I know it will produce a great watertight model ready for printing, but really just about any CAD software would work. I started by placing a canvas of one of the images I took previously, which I will be using as a reference. I calibrated the canvas by selecting 2 points that I measured earlier and entered in the distance so that it is the correct size. I then began sketching the general outer shape. I intentionally wanted to make it a little larger than what it needs to be, since I can always do some sanding to get it to fit. Next, I moved on to sketching some of the details that I wanted to incorporate, such as the holes and circular sections that you see in certain parts of this rear panel. I'm making sure to make the holes on the rear panel that I'm designing quite a bit larger than what they are in the real body so that I can ensure that they will show up when being printed. At this stage of the design, I'm incorporating some of the more significant details that I want to include and moving them around a little until they are in the location similar to where they are in the reference image. Here I'm making another sketch perpendicular to the first one, which I will use to make the main body. I'm using some points from the first sketch to figure out where I want to make some of these sections that stick out, since as you can see in the image on the right, this section is not just one flat piece of metal. Again, here I play around with the sketch quite a bit, adjusting angles and distances of the lines until I'm satisfied with the shape. I'm also keeping in mind that I do not want to add anything to this part that would be too difficult to print. For example, that thin horizontal section that runs below where the taillights go needs to be designed thicker so that it will be easy to print. Here I'm beginning to extrude elements from each sketch, which I will later combine into one solid body. I'm also making some adjustments to certain faces. I don't think modifying the body in this way changes the original sketch. So in certain situations, it might be better to go back and make changes to the original sketch, rather than moving the faces like I'm doing here. I just wanted to tweak a few sections to get it to look how I wanted. I split the body along the profile that I created in the first sketch to trim off the ends. With this part now starting to take shape, I begin combining some of the individual bodies together and adding some chamfers and bevels to a lot of the edges. Next, I modeled the bumper reinforcement. This was a very simple part to make. I started by creating a sketch and made the side profile, which I will later extrude. I made sure that this part will not be too thin. I create another sketch so I can cut each end at an angle. I then add a few details. And with that complete, I was now finished with the rear section. I then moved on to designing the front, once again starting by adding a canvas to use as a reference. At this point, the part was already starting to look good, though after having another look at the physical model car, I realized I needed to make some adjustments, including lowering the height of the section where the front bumper will be mounted. I made sure to design the front bumper supports so that the bash bar that I'll be designing after this can easily be mounted. I created some notches, and later we'll be adding a screw hole to each side to make securing the bash bar easy. I decided to rotate the mounts 90 degrees since this will make the screws easier to access with them facing the top rather than the sides. Now I can begin to make the bash bar. I simply create a sketch with the shape and design that I want, and then I convert the sketch lines into pipes. I do not want the bash bar to sit too low, so I eventually decided to modify the mounts to allow it to sit up higher. I also wanted to add some additional support to the bottom. With the bash bar positioned where I wanted it, I beveled the edges of the mounts before mirroring each body. I used those two cylinders I created earlier to cut holes through each part, so that I will be able to secure the bash bar with screws. With everything looking good, I combined each mount to the bash bar to create one solid body, and then I added a few more details before finishing. With all the parts that I'll be using for the front and rear now finished, I can move on to printing. Although some of the parts, such as the front bash bar, I plan on printing on an SLA printer since it will produce a higher quality part with more detail. For testing purposes, I printed everything on an FDM printer using PLA plastic. I used a 0.25 nozzle and a 0.1mm layer height to make the parts as smooth and detailed as possible. The completed parts look great. The only thing I changed was that I shortened the bash bar just a bit so it doesn't stick out too far. I can't wait to get these parts sanded and painted and installed onto the car. I think the addition of these pieces is really going to help give it a more unique drift missile look. I'm going to need to make some modifications to the chassis, especially in the front, in order to get everything to fit. Of course, I'll be showcasing all of that and more in an upcoming video. I hope you enjoyed this video and it has provided you with some ideas and inspiration that you can apply to your own projects. These parts were not difficult nor time-consuming to make, especially with the addition of the reference images. So I highly recommend giving something like this a try. You could also make something very similar using styrene if you didn't have access to a printer, which is something I may do for a future build just to change things up a bit. But that is all for today's video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.